Hi, my name is Michael Finney. Welcome to the broadcast. Today I have Mathew Crawford joining me for a chat. Mr. Crawford dropped out of college junior year and headed to Wall Street to work at D.E. Shaw. In 2003, he assisted in building The Art of Problem Solving, an education technology startup, and then went on to organize a number of education centers. We're going to talk about Gresham's law, which says bad money drives out good. Let's begin by asking, what exactly is money?
Thanks, Michael. Well, money is a graph and a ledger, and a lot of us didn't necessarily think of it that way before cryptocurrency came about. But it starts with, there are a lot of people, maybe the people are the nodes, or every account they have is a node. And a graph is those nodes and all the possible connections between them, where a person can pass that money from one account on one person to another. But sometimes money is something else in addition to those things, a convention, a commodity, or a protocol. Money, in the case of money going back to ancient times, very often that convention had to do with the way people dressed and their status. They signified skin in the game. Somebody would collect their currency, their money, and put a certain amount of it within their status in their clothing.
All right, so maybe it's fair to refer to money as an abstraction tool, a way of showing value or wealth. Though that's not always the case, for example, when we begin thinking of it as a protocol that carries information itself. Let's dial into what Gresham was saying about good money and bad money.
Yeah, the protocol matters. Sometimes there might be two different coins, which are both decreed by law that they must be accepted by vendors. And in the case of Gresham, we have a situation where Elizabeth I debased the monetary supply. She made new coins that were of the same denomination out of cheaper metals. And as a result, people who had both types of coins would spend the ones made out of cheaper metals. And in fact, in some cases, historically, the coins that were made out of the more expensive metals, they might have, people who stored those coins might have sold them for scrap, maybe collected gold, an even more valuable metal, and then had better savings as a result.
And there's a more recent example regarding coinage in the U.S. as well.
Yeah, from the late 1700s to about 1900, the U.S. used both gold and silver for currency. And the policies changed a little bit over time, but by the 1890s, there was a pretty serious situation where gold and silver were pegged at a ratio of, I think it was 16 to 1 or 12 to 1 or something like that. And because of this, and because the fact that gold was mined at a proportionally slower rate, everybody who could would spend their silver first, and they might even spend it in a way such that anything that they got they could store in gold. They would go redeem any silver, paper, dollars for gold as much as possible, knowing the gold would be worth more than the proportional silver that they might have saved.
Will you give us more background on bimetallism through the 20th century?
Yeah, and eventually that bimetallism policy collapsed when people stored all their money that they could in gold, people who were able to save, and it became very expensive for the U.S. to continue that policy. Now, moving forward, even today, or even closer to today, from 1932 to 1964, quarters and some other U.S. coins were made with a whole lot of silver. I think the quarters were almost 90% silver. And because that silver became worth way more than a quarter, I think right now, if you find one of these quarters, it's worth about $5. Mm-hmm. So, these quarters are almost not found anymore in circulation. Anybody who finds one who recognizes what it is doesn't spend it for a quarter. They hold it instead. They might even just sell it to a collector, might even get scrapped.
Right. My grandfather collected those when I was a kid. Can you give us some non-monetary examples to relate Gresham's law?
One good example of Gresham's law has to do with cars and the marketplace for buying and selling used cars. Let's say that there is some car like I won't pick a make and model. Let's say that some car X has some really good cars produced from the line that are not going to have any problems for years and years, and some of them are lemons. Now, some people hold their cars forever, but let's say that that going into the used car market, half the cars are good and half the cars are lemons. Let's say that the good cars are worth about $15,000 a piece, and the bad cars are worth about $10,000 a piece. Well, if you're the used car salesman and you don't know which is which, how do you price them? Well, you might try to pick a number in the middle, like 12.5. But here's the problem with that. If you're buying cars from people in order to sell them at 12.5, you might pay 10,000. The people who have lemons are very happy to sell you their lemons, but the people who have the better cars are not happy to sell them to you for the lesser amount of money that they're going to get paid for them. So they may pull their cars out of that public market and try to sell them privately. And in that sense, the bad cars would drive out the good as far as the cars that are available at the used car lot. And this is a good example, too, because it also brings us to a distinction between, what we're really talking about between public and private markets. Really and truly, almost everything that you might call a currency, whether it's a dollar or a stock or bond, there are public markets where all these things can get traded for each other, but there are also private markets, and some of them will only trade liquidly on private markets and only over time. Just like the better cars in that example. So when bad money drives out good, it often means that good money is held or stored, but then sometimes only exchanged in a more private market. Another kind of humorous example of Gresham's law might be mating. Let's say, a lot of people start, the mating game in their late teens or their early 20s, and a lot of people get married in their 20s. But let's take the example of somebody who waits for a long time to mate, maybe till they're 40 years old, and then they go to the bar and they look around the bar, and there aren't a lot of good catches there anymore because all the good ones are taken, and so the selection at the bar is not that great. And so even if that person is a very high quality suit, they may simply go through other channels through their friends or social clubs in order to find somebody to get married to.
Do you have a good modern anecdote?
Another example that helps with the intuition is universities. If we just create, let's imagine in our minds two similar quality universities, let's say in neighboring states, University A and University B, and they have roughly the same type of student and roughly the same tuition. And then one day, University A says, we are going to allow anyone who wants to come join our classes so long as they can pay the tuition. Well, if we think about what's going to happen, the bad students may begin to drive out the good students. If you're a really top-notch student and you have the choice between going to one of these schools, if you go to University A, you might be in the classroom with a lot of people who are not as diligent or who need to catch up in order to join the conversation. It might drag the conversation down. And so you might simply choose to go to University B instead. Maybe the University B begins to soak up all the higher quality students, and University A begins to soak up the lower quality students. And then you may have tuition divergence, reputation divergence, and everything else. Spiro Agnew is noted for saying bad news drives out good, and he intended this to be looked at as Gresham's law, a corollary of Gresham's law. And he's right. It's a point that we make all the time. We only see bad news on the television. We only see bad news on our internet feeds. But that doesn't mean that there isn't good news. Somebody like Steven Pinker tells us, hey, the world is better than ever. And while I don't completely subscribe to Steven Pinker's worldview, I think there are some places where we need to be sure that the world isn't becoming too fragile or too unstable. But he makes a good point. Obviously, there's plenty of good news in the world, a lot of wealth creation, a lot of people being brought out of poverty. But when there's so much bad news in the media, it may be that the good news gets passed in ways that are more wholesome and more fulfilling in terms of transmitting that knowledge, whether it's through personal conversations or information from a book or longer form articles. That seems to be more likely where we get our good news.
All right, we've heard a number of examples to relate Gresham's law. Next, will you bring the conversation back around to finance and monetary policy? Give us some specifics about what we might see happen in an arbitrage scenario like this.
So we have all these good examples of Gresham's law in markets that we think of as ordinary markets, even in places where we don't usually think of it, things as a market. But though in the 1980s, some economists came forward and said, hey, wait a minute, you know what? Really and truly, in order for Gresham's law to work, it must be the case that both currencies are explicitly decreed to be of the same value in trade. And 1890s bimetallism in the United States is such an example. Elizabeth I making a second coin with the same denomination would be an example. But I think this gets us to a point that's a little bit too. These are cases where you do have pure arbitrage, between the good money and the bad. You can hold on to the good money and get more value out of it at some point in time. But I think that going through all of these different types of examples, we can see that we don't necessarily have to be quite so strict and literal when thinking about how Gresham's law affects the world. And this really brings us to a point where we can start thinking about cryptocurrency, for instance. Cryptocurrency is so different from ordinary types of money, and it may or may not ever be the case that that law steps in and decrees some kind of a peg between Bitcoin and some fiat currency, the dollar, for instance. But however, we can use Gresham's law in the same kind of thinking that we did before. If we have two different currencies with two different sets of properties, we might say, hey, well, if one of these sets of properties is going to be more valuable for me in the future, then maybe I will hold on to that currency as opposed to the other one. So we may be, kind of weighing, several properties against each other and thinking about whether or not one of them will be the bad money that drives out the good. And it's almost surely the case that there's a certain amount of smart money in the world, people who are better at collecting and storing wealth, and the decisions that they make will probably drive the marketplace more than anyone else. So, for instance, if people who build and store wealth decide that one of two currencies is going to appreciate in value faster in the future or depreciate slower, then they may choose to hold on to the currency that maintains or strengthens in value. And then it may be that the rest of the marketplace simply has to follow. Now, when people start making these decisions about which money is the good money and which money is the bad money, they may look to inflation and deflation. Currently, for fiat currencies, the supply gets inflated by, let's say, a central bank every once in a while. New dollars are printed and released into the market. Usually, this inflation is meant to match the inflation of things that match the amount of money people are going to spend on like groceries at the grocery store or commodities, for instance, some kind of a consumer price index. Regardless, the dollar supply will inflate in supply. Whereas if you have something like Bitcoin that never does inflate in supply, then people may be choosing that currency to hold on to because it will hold on to its relative value better over time. So that's one possibility why people are talking about Gresham's law in terms of cryptocurrency.
Can you give us an inverted example of Gresham's law or something similar to it that still has the same effects?
There is a law that kind of runs opposite to Gresham's law called Thier's law. Now, if there are two currencies and one of them begins to inflate in supply very, very quickly to a point where we have hyperinflation, and if there's another currency available for people to jump into, then the good money may begin to drive out the bad, as vendors don't even want to take the bad money that's going to be, worse than worthless, or basically just worthless. Like in Zimbabwe, where people would walk around with stacks or a wheelbarrow of cash, people don't even want to take it at some point, and so they're just going to only trade in terms of the better currency. So that's a situation where good money would drive out bad, and that may be at some point the situation if we have really terrible end to the fiat currency era. Then it may be that everybody jumps on cryptocurrency and uses it for payment in markets.
And that may be a lot of the reason why we see people becoming so excited about what cryptocurrency and specifically Bitcoin can offer to the industry of banking.
Well, hyper-Bitcoinization is this theorized process by which Bitcoin becomes the one currency, and everything and all stored value and commonly traded value begins to pour into it. And if that happens, we may see a lot of the other currencies go basically dead in value, but we also might see the value of Bitcoin rise according to the rate of world wealth growth. And that's a point at which it also makes a lot of investments look not as good as they did before. For instance, large dinosaur corporations are going to have to beat that rate of wealth growth in order to be able to trade their stock for the currency of Bitcoin. So as we can see, a lot of things could change. So thinking in terms of Gresham law at least gets us to a point where we can begin to think about how those changes might take place in a world in which cryptocurrency becomes accepted and common and well used.
Hey, Matt, thanks for joining me today and talking a little bit about Gresham's law. Hopefully we can talk again in the future. Have a good day.
Yeah, thanks so much, Michael. I enjoyed it.
If you enjoy content like this, please connect with me on your preferred social network.